The day I stopped being the family ATM and protected my daughter. There are certain moments in life that arrive quietly, without fanfare or warning, and yet they change everything. They do not announce themselves with dramatic music or flashing lights. They simply land softly, cruelly in the middle of an ordinary evening, at an ordinary dinner table, surrounded by people you have known your entire life. And in that single, unremarkable moment, something inside you shifts, not slowly, not gradually. All at once, like a door slamming shut on a past you had been dragging behind you for years. This is one of those stories. My name is Nora. I am a wife, a mother, a daughter, and for most of my adult life, I was also something else, the family fixer. The one who paid when there was a gap. The one who stayed quiet when there was tension. The one who smiled through things that deserved a response. I told myself this was loyalty. I told myself this was love. It took my 12-year-old daughter sitting frozen at a dinner table, eyes wide with the kind of quiet devastation children carry when adults let them down, for me to finally understand what it actually was. It was not love. It was a pattern, and patterns, unlike feelings, can be broken. Let me take you back to that evening. We had been invited to my parents' home for a family dinner, 3 days before my mother's milestone birthday. The kind of birthday that comes with phrases like, once in a lifetime, and celebrating everything you've built. Though in our family, what had been built was considerably more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head of the table like she had been placed there by royal decree. My father, quiet and accommodating as always, hovered nearby with the familiar energy of a man who had spent decades choosing peace over honesty. My sister Katie sat across from us with her husband Nick and their 3 children, Elliot, 13, Ruby, 9, and Nico, 5, sprawled around the table as if the furniture had been arranged specifically for them. And then there was my daughter, Sienna, 12 years old, bright, perceptive, the kind of child who absorbs the emotional temperature of every room she enters. She had been quieter than usual that evening, picking at her food with the careful restraint of a child who senses, but cannot name the tensions swirling around her. When the conversation turned to birthday decorations and dress codes, and the general excitement of the upcoming celebration, Sienna finally relaxed. She leaned forward with soft, hopeful eyes and asked the most innocent question a child can ask. What should I wear? It was the question of a child who wanted to belong. A child who was asking, in the only language available to her, am I welcome? Do I matter here? Tell me the rules and I will follow them perfectly. My mother did not even look at her. She picked up her glass of water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and said, in the same breezy tone you used to mention a change in weather, "Oh, your daughter is not invited to my birthday." The words landed on the table, like something dropped from a great height. I watched Sienna's face change in real time. One moment she was open, hopeful, leaning in. The next she was still, not crying, not angry, just still. The way a light goes out when the power is cut. No flicker, no warning, just dark. What made it worse, what made it so much worse, was what happened next. Nothing. Everyone kept eating. Forks scraped against plates. Conversations shifted. The room absorbed the cruelty and moved on as if nothing had occurred. My father cleared his throat and contributed nothing meaningful. My sister glanced at her own children with the practiced detachment of someone who had decided in advance not to get involved. My husband, Ben, always steady, always careful, tightened his grip on his fork so slightly that only I noticed. I set my fork down. My voice, when it came, was very calm. It is worth noting that calm is not always kindness. Sometimes calm is the sound of a decision being made. I asked my mother what she meant. She smiled, not a real smile, but the decorative kind, and explained that the party was adults only. A special occasion. Sienna simply would not fit in. I looked across the table. Katie's 3 children were seated right there. Children ranging from 5 to 13 years old. I pointed this out. My mother waved a hand. There had been exceptions, she said, for them. I asked why. She tilted her head and used a word I recognized immediately, different. They were different. It is a particular word, chosen with precision because it sounds neutral while meaning something very specific. It means favored. It means chosen. It means your child is not one of the ones I count. I told my mother I was not going to sit at her table and pretend this was normal. I told her calmly, firmly, without raising my voice, that if my daughter was not welcome, then neither were we. My mother called me dramatic. My father said my name once, gently, uselessly. My sister suggested it was just a party, as though a child learning she is less than her cousins in her grandmother's eyes is something that can be filed under just. I gathered my daughter and we left. Behind us, my mother's parting words landed exactly as intended. Drama queen, as always. In the car, no one spoke for a long time. Ben drove steadily. Sienna stared out the window. Then, from the back seat, in a voice so careful it nearly undid me, she asked, "Does Grandma love my cousins more than me?" There are questions that have answers and questions that have only truth. I turned slightly in my seat so she could see my face. I told her the only honest thing I could offer without breaking her open. I told her that I loved her, and that I would not allow anyone to keep making her feel like she did not belong. That night, after she was in bed, I sat alone in my kitchen and let the anger sharpen itself into something useful. Now there is context you need to understand. What happened at that dinner table was not an isolated incident. It was the latest chapter in a story that had been written long before Sienna was born, one that began when I was a child myself, watching my mother apply rules selectively, generously to some and strictly to others, always with a perfectly reasonable explanation ready. I was 10 years old at Katie's birthday party when my mother pulled me aside and told me I was too old to participate in the games. "Rules are rules," she said, while two of her friends' children, both older than me, played freely in the game circle without a word being said. Special cases, apparently. There is nothing quite like the education of watching someone selectively enforce a rule and being expected to accept the explanation with a smile. That pattern continued through every stage of our growing up, when I received a school award. My mother sighed and said there was no need to make a big deal. When Katie received a similar recognition, suddenly the calendar cleared, the relatives were called, the photos were taken, and the celebratory dinner was booked. I learned, over the years, to celebrate quietly, to keep my joy inside my own chest where it could not be diminished, to be grateful for whatever I was given, even when it was far less than what was given to someone else. By the time I became a mother, I told myself I had made peace with the past. Then Katie had children, and the familiar architecture simply rebuilt itself with new occupants. My parents treated Katie's 3 children, Elliot, Ruby, and Nico, as the default grandchildren, the primary set. The ones whose names came first, whose invitations arrived without question, whose inclusion was never up for debate. Sienna, my one child, existed at the edges of this arrangement, sometimes included, sometimes remembered, often quietly left out. When I asked why Sienna wasn't included in various outings and events, the answer was always some variation of their siblings. They do things together. As though being a cousin rather than a sibling was a lesser classification. As though my daughter being my daughter rather than Katie's made her less entitled to a grandparent's love. I watched Sienna absorb this over the years. I watched her stop asking if she was invited. I watched her school her expression so that the disappointment would not show. Children are remarkable in their capacity to adapt to being made to feel small. What is not remarkable is allowing the people responsible to continue without consequence. Then came the money. It began the way these things always do, gradually, reasonably, with the language of fairness coding something that was not fair at all. My parents were struggling financially. Both daughters should contribute equally, my mother said. It was only right. So I agreed because I had been trained by a lifetime of practice to be the reasonable one. The exception arrived on schedule. Katie, my mother explained, had 3 children. Her expenses were higher. Life was more difficult for a family of 5. I, with my one child, had more flexibility. Without any formal conversation or agreement, the math shifted. Katie's contribution shrank. Mine grew. Eventually, I was covering the majority of their expenses, a monthly mortgage payment, general financial support, utilities, month after month after month. And then came the party account. My parents opened a shared account for the milestone birthday celebrations. Both daughters would contribute. Communal, practical, fair. The majority of the balance, when I reviewed it, was money I had put in. Katie and my mother planned everything, the venue, the catering, the guest list, all of it, using a card linked to that account as though it were simply a resource that existed for their use, and my role was to replenish it. I told myself it was not worth fighting about. I kept making that calculation, the math of how much conflict costs versus how much compliance costs, and kept choosing compliance. Until the evening, my daughter leaned across a dinner table and asked what she should wear, and was told she was not welcome. That was the calculation I could no longer make. The morning after the dinner, I woke up with something unfamiliar. Not anger, anger had been present for years. This was clarity, the particular stillness that follows a decision made completely, without reservation or second guessing. Ben was in the kitchen. I told him simply, "We are not going to the party. None of us." He asked if I was certain. I told him that if Sienna was not welcome, we were not welcome either. Sienna came downstairs, still wearing the sadness of the night before in her posture and her tired eyes. When I told her we were not going, her shoulders dropped in a way I recognized instantly. The physical release of a tension she had been holding since the previous evening. She said, "Okay," very quietly, and that single syllable contained more relief than any celebration could have offered. Then I opened my banking application. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I have seen this kind of thing described as revenge or cruelty, and it was neither. What I did was stop. I stopped paying for people who had decided my daughter was optional. The standing transfer labeled mortgage assistance, canceled. The monthly family support payment, canceled. The utilities contribution, canceled. 5 years of financial obligation, undone in 30 seconds and a fingerprint scan. I sat with the screen in front of me for a moment and thought about how easy it had been. How the arrangement had required nothing from them except my continued willingness to participate. Then I addressed the party account. There was a virtual card connected to it, and large vendor payments were still incoming, the kind of final balances that land just before an event. My mother had assumed that card would continue to work. She had assumed, as she always had, that my function was to fund and to endure. I disabled the card. Then I reviewed the account balance, identified the portion representing my contributions, and transferred it back to myself, quietly, without a note, without an announcement. Then I bought a box, wrapped it neatly, and placed inside it a letter. I wrote that letter carefully, not in the heat of fury, not as an attack, but as a statement, the kind that says, "I see the pattern clearly, I am nomming it plainly, and I am done." I told my mother I had spent years making excuses for her behavior. I told her I had watched my daughter go still at a dinner table while the adults around her pretended nothing had happened. I told her I was a mother first, and that my primary obligation was to the child in my care, not to the comfort of people who treated that child like she was optional. I told her that effective immediately, we would not be attending the party, we would not be continuing family contact, and we would not be providing financial support of any kind. I folded the letter, slid it into the box, and mailed it time to arrive on the day of the party. When the gifts were being opened, when the guests were gathered, when my mother expected gratitude and applause. The first call came that afternoon. My mother's name lit up my screen and I let it ring twice before answering, because I am still, after everything, a person with some residual sense of occasion. Her voice came through the speaker at high volume. "How dare you?" she demanded. "How dare you do this to me on my birthday?" I said nothing. Silence is a remarkable instrument when someone is expecting you to scramble. She told me she had opened the gift in front of her guests. I thought about how that must have unfolded, the expectant smile, the speech about how her daughter couldn't attend but still loved her, the slow unwrapping, the realization. In the background, I could hear voices, the clink of glassware, and then my father's voice, close to the phone, asking her, not me, what she had done. She told me I had humiliated her. I told her I had not read it aloud. She shifted immediately to the money. The vendors were calling. The card was not working. The account was empty. I told her I had withdrawn my financial support, effective immediately. She told me I could not do that. I told her she had excluded my child. She said the party was adults only. I reminded her that Elliot, Ruby, and Nico were in attendance. She said they were different. I said Sienna was family, or she was supposed to be. I ended the call. What followed over the next several days was the family telephone tree activating at speed. Aunts, cousins, family friends I had not spoken to in years, all calling to ask how I could do such a thing. I stopped engaging after the third call. "This is private," I said. "I am not discussing it." The people who actually mattered to me, a small number of cousins and close friends, asked differently. They asked what had happened rather than what I had done. When I told them plainly, they said simply, "That was not right." It was strange how much it meant, hearing the truth stated without a committee vote. Then the invoice arrived. Printed on venue letterhead, itemized professional with payment due in 5 days, and my name listed as the responsible party. Room rental, staffing, bar deposit, late-added guest count. Over €2,000 billed to me for a party I had not been planning, for a celebration I had not been coordinating, at an event my daughter had not been invited to attend. I called the vendor. I told them I had not signed the contract, had not authorized the charges, and would not be paying them. I told them they needed to pursue the actual signatory. I asked them to remove my contact information from the account. They made a note. The call ended. That afternoon came the knocking, not polite, not cautious. The kind of knocking that announces its intention before the door is opened. I sent Sienna to her room with her headphones. Then I opened the door. My mother and father stood on the porch, Katie beside them, Nick slightly behind, carrying the expression of a man attending an event he did not choose. My mother demanded to know if I could at least cover the birthday venue costs. She explained they were already in debt. They could not manage this alone. I looked at her for a long moment and said, as evenly as I could manage, that she was asking me to pay for a party I had not been welcome at. My father attempted to soften it. Katie called it unfair. 3 children, tight finances, difficult circumstances. I asked her plainly what that had to do with me funding her life. She said I was acting as though they had done something wrong. I reminded her that excluding my daughter from her grandmother's birthday while inviting all 3 of hers was, in fact, wrong. My mother told me that family helps family. I agreed. I told her family also does not single out a child and call it a policy. I told her I was stepping out of the role that had been assigned to me, the one where I paid and smiled while my daughter was treated like she was peripheral. She asked if I was really doing this. I said yes. She said it was over one party. I told her it had never been one party. It had been one party too many. There was a silence after that, the specific silence of someone realizing that the leverage they have relied on is gone. My father's shoulders dropped. Katie's expression held something I had not expected to see there. Not just anger, but fear. The fear, I think, of understanding what was coming next, that the weight being lifted from me would be redistributed, and she was the only one standing close enough to receive it. My mother turned away. She said it was unbelievable, after everything they had done for me. Ben's hand touched my back lightly. They walked down the porch one by one. At the driveway, my mother looked back and told me I would regret this. I closed the door. My hands shook for about 10 seconds, and then they stopped. Sienna's bedroom door opened a crack. She peered out with careful eyes and asked if they were gone. I told her yes. She asked if we were in trouble. That question reached something old and tender in me, the memory of being a child myself, believing that adult anger was a law that could not be escaped. I crouched in front of her and told her she was not in trouble. I told her none of this was her fault. I told her I was not going to allow anyone to treat her as though she mattered less. She swallowed once, nodded, and for the first time since that dinner, she looked lighter. 6 months passed, then a year. Our house changed, not in any dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small things. Sienna began singing again while she did homework softly, just under her breath. Ben and I stopped bracing ourselves every time the phone rang. We replaced a broken dishwasher without needing to plan around it financially, which sounds small until you understand what it represents. The freedom to handle ordinary life without first calculating what other people need from you. The guilt attempts continued for a while. Extended family checked in. People insisted they were not taking sides while absolutely taking sides. I kept my responses short. Sometimes I did not respond at all. Through various channels, I eventually heard that my parents had adjusted. They downsized. My mother found part-time work. Katie found a more stable position. They managed. They had always been capable of managing. They simply had not needed to while I was available. Then one afternoon, over a year after the birthday, my phone rang. Katie. Sienna was out with a friend. I answered anyway. Her voice was tired rather than combative. She told me our mother had been a great deal to manage lately. Money, time, constant requests. She said, after a pause, that she had not realized how much I had been doing. Not really. Not until she was the one being asked. She said what had happened to Sienna at that dinner was not right. It was not an apology precisely, not the formal, comprehensive accounting that years of history deserved. But it was the closest thing to accountability our family had ever produced, and I recognized it for what it was. I told her okay. She said she was not calling to pull me back in. She just wanted me to know. When I hung up, Ben looked over from across the room and asked how I felt. I told him, steady. Because my home was calm. My daughter was safe. My finances were my own. And the people who had spent years making my child feel like she was less than enough no longer had any access to either of us. That was the outcome. That was the whole point. There is a version of this story where I am the villain, the daughter who abandoned her aging parents, the sister who chose conflict over compromise, the woman who sent a letter inside a birthday gift like a weapon. I understand why someone who only sees the ending might arrive at that version. But there is another version, which is the true one. It is the story of a 12-year-old girl who asked what she should wear to her grandmother's birthday and was told she was not invited. It is the story of a mother who watched her daughter go still and made a decision. It is the story of what it costs to be the family fixer for years and years, and what it feels like when you finally, quietly, stop. Some people are worth the work of staying. Some relationships are worth the investment of repair. But some patterns, the ones built on hierarchy and favoritism, and the assumption that certain people will always absorb more than their share, those patterns do not heal themselves. They continue until someone refuses to participate. My daughter is no longer waiting to find out if she belongs. She already knows the answer. And so do I.